can get out of any crisis without using taxpayers' money and without reducing public welfare spending as a result and austerity, because we can just use the reality of bank accounting to get cleanly out of any banking crisis. And this is also what central banks have done in the past when they didn't want a banking crisis to turn into a major recession. They just solved the problem like this. You can do it in one morning and you will not have a real banking crisis and you will not have a recession. This is what Ben Bernanke did in 2008. And he was actually, I proposed all these things in the 90s in Japan in these big debates we had where I also proposed quantitative easing. And Bernanke was joining these debates. And he was in 2008 the only central banker to implement my advice, the true quantitative easing, because the others slightly changed the definition. Step one, you have a bust banking system. The capital and the Basel approach is not enough. You know, it's this tiny amount anyway. And when the banks create money, use it for financial transactions, push up asset prices by 300–400%, which is due to banks creating this money for financial transactions. At the peak, if then asset prices drop by 10%, you've used up all the equity for the non-performing loans already, you're bust. So that's why we have the banking crises. So how do you get out of this quickly at no cost to the taxpayer? It's very simple. The central bank steps in, goes to the banks and says, oh, you've got non-performing assets larger than your equity, you're bust, all of you, bust banking system, always the same story. No problem, because we don't want a banking crisis now turning into a big recession. We will let you off this time. We will put in place measures to prevent this in the future. We'll talk about what those are, but we'll get you out of this one now. And you don't use tax money. That's expensive. That increases national debt. Ireland was a fiscal poster boy, but because the ECB forced it to fiscalize all the banking non-performing assets, Ireland became bankrupt, had to call in the IMF. No, we don't do that. The central bank steps in, goes to the banks and purchases the non-performing assets at face value. And the problem is solved. There's no cost. And this is exactly what Bernanke did. That's why in September, October 2008, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve quadrupled in 1 month. This doesn't create inflation. Some people thought at the time, wow, we're going to get hyperinflation now. They're inflating their way out. No. If you want to create inflation, some countries try to do this allegedly, like Japan for 20 years. It's not going to work with this method because it doesn't create money, because you're just shifting assets between the central bank and the banks in the right way, away from the bank balance sheets where they are harmful to the central bank, where they can't do any harm. But you don't inject money into the non-banking sector, so you can't create inflation. Oh, but hang on, the dollar is going to collapse. Well, no, as I said at the time, and it's strengthened. Why? Because you're not creating money, you're solving the problem in the banking system. The banks are healthy again, have strong balance sheets, and can lend again. And they did in America. It's the first country to get out of the crisis. Since then, very strong bank credit growth. Unfortunately, too much. That's why we're back in the same spot. They continue to create credit for financial transactions. That's how you prevent getting into this situation in the first place of banks being unstable. Because banks create money, you have to split the stream of credit creation from banks into two, for the real economy and for financial transactions, because they're not part of the real economy. And if banks create credit for financial transactions, you are creating an asset bubble, which is always unsustainable and will always lead to a banking crisis ultimately, if it's large enough. So in the early 2000s, I was warning that in Europe, the ECB, which is newly created, was going to create bank credit-driven asset bubbles, banking crises, unemployment, large recessions in the Eurozone. And that's exactly what they did in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, based on 30% credit growth for how many years? 3–4 years. Way ahead of GDP growth. This is all credit creation by banks for asset transactions, property, real estate. That's how you blow up these countries, and that's what the ECB did.
You mentioned the real economy. Where are the banks, where is the banking sector, where are the central banks in all this? Do they participate in, as they create money, do they create value? Are they part of the larger GDP? What can you tell us about that?
First of all, what is the link between banks and GDP? The banks have a crucial role. They are in what we call our market economies the decision-making, control center of the entire economy. Why? Because they create the money supply and they decide who gets money for what purpose. Is this an important decision? You bet it is. In fact, that is the decision that completely reshapes the economic landscape in just a few months or years. You know, the decision of who gets purchasing power for what purpose, newly created money. So the banks are the control center in the economy, and that's why we need to distinguish between bank lending for transactions that boost GDP, then you get high economic growth, no inflation, job creation, everything is stable, you get also less inequality, you get more equality. But if banks create money for unproductive purposes, either for consumption, then you get only nominal GDP growth, but low real GDP growth, you get inflation, that's not good, that's well recognized. But the biggest problem has been in the last 30 years, banks creating money for unproductive purposes that are asset transactions. That's not part of GDP. And when banks do this, bank lending for property, bank lending for asset, stock market, whatever financial instrument transactions, lending to private equity funds, to hedge funds, investing in financial instruments, which banks do a lot because all the leverage of these funds comes from banks, plain old bank lending, bank credit creation. So this money creation for asset transactions, of course, is pushing up asset prices, creating these asset bubbles. While it happens, it looks stable because we're all making money, we're all having returns, but they're all based on the capital gains and the expectations of capital gains, and that will continue only as long as banks continue to create new money for asset transactions. It's a game of musical chairs. If we took out all the chairs where nobody's sitting, and then only have all the chairs where you're sitting in the room, and then we take one out, and we ask everyone to stand up, we take one chair out, right? This game of musical chairs. And we have the music on, and if the music stops, everyone has to sit down, but one chair is missing. Well, this is the credit creation for financial transactions. It's a game of musical chairs. When the music stops, that's when the banks do not anymore expand credit creation for financial transactions, but they stop it or slow it. Then there won't be enough chairs for the speculators, those who've borrowed money and invested in financial instruments, to sit on. There will be bankruptcies. But the moment there are bankruptcies, banks will have non-performing loans, the banks get more risk averse, they reduce lending, then as they reduce lending, asset prices come down further, there's fewer and fewer chairs, there's more bankruptcies, and of course you will end up with a massive banking crisis. That is the mechanism.